Chapter 7. With a delicacy that always seemed so incongruous in a being his size, Chewbacca maneuvered the Falcon into his precisely selected orbital slot above the lush green moon of Endor. Rumbling under his breath, he switched over the power linkages and cut the engines back to standby. Seated in the co pilot seat, Leia took a deep breath, wincing as one of the twins kicked her from inside. Doesn't look like Cabarac's here yet, she commented, realizing even as she said it how superfluous the comment was. She'd been watching the sensors from the moment they dropped out of lightspeed, and given there were no other ships anywhere in the system, there wasn't much chance that they would have missed him. But with the familiar engine roar now cut back down to a whisper, the silence felt strange and even a little eerie to her. Chewbacca growled a question. We wait, I guess, Leia shrugged. Actually, we're almost a day early. We got here faster than I'd expected. Chewbacca turned back to his board, growling his own interpretation of the Nogri's absence. Oh, come on, Leia chided in. If he'd decided to make this meeting into a trap, don't you think they'd have had a couple of Star Destroyers and an interdictor cruiser waiting to meet us? Your Highness, 3PO's voice called from down the tunnel. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I believe I've located the fault in the Carbonti countermeasures package. Could you ask Chewbacca to step back for a moment? Leia raised her eyebrows in mild surprise as she looked at Chewbacca. As was depressingly normal with the Falcon, several bits of equipment had gone out early in the flight from Coruscant. Up to his elbows with more important repairs, Chewbacca had assigned the relatively low priority work on the Carbanti to 3PO. Leia had had no objections, though given the results the last time 3PO had tried to work on the Falcon, she hadn't expected very much to come of it. You'll make a repair droid out of him yet, she said to Chewbacca. Your influence, no doubt. The Wookiee snorted his opinion of that as he got out of the pilot's seat and headed back to see what 3PO had found. The cockpit doors slid open, closed again behind him, leaving the cockpit that much quieter. You see that planet down there, my dears? Leia murmured, rubbing her belly gently. That's Endor, where the Rebel Alliance finally triumphed over the Empire and the New Republic began. Or at least, she amended silently to herself, that was what the history someday would say. That the death of the Empire occurred at Endor, with all the rest of it merely a mopping up action. A mopping up action which had lasted 5 years so far, and could wind up lasting another 20 the way things were going. She let her eyes drift across the brilliant mottled green world turning slowly beneath them, wondering yet again why she'd chosen this place for her rendezvous with Cabarac. True, it was a system that practically every being in both the Republic and the Imperial sections of the galaxy had heard of and knew how to find, and with the major planes of contention long gone from the sector, it was a quiet enough place for two ships to meet. But there were memories here, too, some of which Leia would just as soon not bring to mind. Before they'd triumphed, they'd very nearly lost everything. From down the tunnel, Chewbacca roared a question. Hang on, I'll check, Leia called back. Leaning over the board, she keyed a switch. It reads Standby Modulo, she reported. Wait a minute. Now it reads System Ready. Do you want me to. And abruptly, without any warning, a black curtain seemed to drop across her vision. Slowly, she became aware that there was a metallic voice calling to her. Your Highness, it said over and over again. Your Highness, can you hear me? Please, Your Highness, can you hear me? She opened her eyes, vaguely surprised to discover they were closed, to find Chewbacca leaning over her with an open medpack gripped in one huge hand, an agitated 3PO hovering like a nervous mother bird behind him. I'm all right, she managed. What happened? You shouted for help, 3PO put in before Chewbacca could answer. At least, we thought it was for help, he amended helpfully. You were brief and rather incoherent. I don't doubt it, Leia told him. It was starting to come back now, like moonlight through the edge of a cloud. The menace, the rage, the hatred, the despair. You didn't feel it, did you? She asked Chewbacca. He growled a negative, watching her closely. I felt nothing either, 3PO put in. Leia shook her head. I don't know what it could have been. One minute I was sitting there, and then the next. She broke off, a sudden horrible thought striking her. Chewie, where does this orbit take us? Does it ever pass through the position where the Death Star blew up? Chewbacca stared at her a moment, rumbling something deep in his throat. Then, shifting the med pack to his other hand, he reached past her to key the computer. The answer came almost immediately. 5 minutes ago, Leia murmured, feeling cold. That would be just about right, wouldn't it? Chewbacca growled an affirmative, then a question. I really don't know, she had to admit. It sounds a little like something Luke went through during his Jedi training, she amended, remembering just in time that Luke still wanted Dagobah's significance to be kept a secret. But he saw a vision. All I felt was, I don't know. It was anger and bitterness, but at the same time there was something almost sad about it. No, sad isn't the right word. She shook her head, sudden tears welling inexplicably up in her eyes. I don't know. Look, I'm all right. You two can go back to what you were doing. Chewbacca rumbled under his breath again, clearly not convinced, but he said nothing else as he closed the med pack and pushed past 3PO. The cockpit door slid open for him. With the proverbial Wookiee disdain for subtlety, he locked it in that position before disappearing down the tunnel into the main body of the ship. Leia focused on 3PO. You too, she told him. Go on. You still have work to do back there. I'm all right, really. Well, very well, Your Highness, the droid said, clearly no happier than Chewbacca was. If you're certain. I am. Go on, scat. 3PO dithered another moment, then obediently shuffled out of the cockpit, and the silence resumed. A silence that was thicker somehow than it had been before, and much darker. Leia set her teeth firmly together. I will not be intimidated, she said aloud to the silence. Not here, not anywhere. The silence didn't reply. After a minute, Leia reached over to the board and keyed in a course alteration that would keep them from again passing through the spot where the Emperor had died. Refusing to be intimidated, after all, didn't mean deliberately asking for trouble. And after that, there was nothing left to do but wait, and wonder if Kabarak would indeed come. The topmost bit of the walled city Illic poked through the clutching trees of the jungle pressing tightly around it, looking to Han for all the world like some sort of dome-topped, silver-skinned droid drowning in a sea of green quicksand. Any idea how we land on that thing? He asked. Probably through those vents near the top, Lando said, pointing at the Lady Luck's main display. They read large enough for anything up to about a W-class space barge to get into. Han nodded, fingers plucking restlessly at the soft armrest of his co-pilot's seat. There weren't a lot of things in the galaxy that could make him nervous, but having to sit there while someone else made a tricky landing was one of them. This is even a crazier place to live than that nomad city thing of yours, he growled. No argument from me, Lando agreed, adjusting their altitude a bit. Several seconds later than Han would have done it. At least on Niklon, we didn't have to worry about getting eaten by some exotic plant. But that's economics for you. At last count, there were 8 cities in this part of New Cov, and 2 more being built. Han grimaced. And all because of those same exotic plants. Or to be specific, the exotic biomolecules that could be harvested from them. The Coveys seemed to think that the profit was worth having to live in armored cities all the time. No one knew what the plants thought about it. They're still crazy, he said. Watch out! They may have magnetic airlocks on those entrance ducts. Lando gave him a patient look. Will you relax? I have flown ships before, you know. Yeah, Han muttered. Setting his teeth together, he settled in to suffer through the landing. It wasn't as bad as he'd expected. Lando got his clearance from control and guided the Lady Luck with reasonable skill into the flaring maw of one of the entrance ducts, following the curved pipe down and inward to a brightly lit landing area just beneath the transparisteel dome that topped the city walls. Inbound customs were a mere formality, though given the planet's dependence on exports, the outbound scrutiny would probably be a lot tighter. They were officially welcomed to Illic by a professional greeter with a professional smile, given a data card with maps of the city and surrounding territory, and then turned loose. That wasn't so hard, Lando commented as they rode a sliding spiral ramp down through the spacious open center. At each level, walkways led outward from the ramp to the market, administrative and living areas of the city. Where are we supposed to be meeting Luke? Three more levels down in one of the entertainment districts, Han told him. The Imperial Library didn't have much detail on this place, but it did mention a little tap cafe called the Mishra attached to some half-size version they've got of the old Grandis Mon Theater on Coruscant. I got the impression it was kind of a watering hole for the local big shots. Sounds like a good place to meet, Lando agreed. He threw Han a sideways look. So, you ready to show me the hook yet? Han frowned. Hook? Come on, you old pirate, Lando snorted. You pick me up at Sluice Van, ask for a lift out to New Cub, send Luke on ahead for this cloak and blade rendezvous, and you expect me to believe you're just going to wave goodbye now and let me go back to Naklon? Han gave his friend his best wounded look. Come on, Lando. The hook, Han. Let me see the hook. Han sighed theatrically. There isn't any hook, Lando, he said. You can leave for Niklon any time you want to. Course, he added casually, if you hung around a little and gave us a hand, you might be able to work a deal here to unload any spare metals you had lying around. Like, a stockpile of Hephridium or something. Carefully keeping his eyes forward, he could still feel the heat of Lando's glare. Luke told you about that, didn't he? Lando demanded. Han shrugged. He might have mentioned it, he conceded. Lando hissed between clenched teeth. I'm going to strangle him, he announced. Jedi or not, I'm going to strangle him. Ah, come on, Lando, Han soothed. You hang around a couple days, you listen to people's jabberings, you maybe dig us out a lead or two about what Failure's got going on here, and that's it. You go home and back to your mining operation, and we never bother you again. I've heard that before, Lando countered, but Han could hear the resignation in his voice. What makes you think Failure's got contacts on New Cove? Because during the war, this was the only place his Bothans ever seemed to care about defending. He broke off, grabbing Lando's arm and turning both of them hard to the right towards the central column of the spiral walkway. What? Lando managed. Quiet, Han hissed, trying to simultaneously hide his face and still watch the figure he'd spotted leaving the ramp, one level down. That Bothan down there, to the left. See him? Lando turned slightly, peering in the indicated direction out of the corner of his eye. What about him? It's Tav Bralia, one of Failure's top aides. You're kidding, Lando said, frowning down at the alien. How can you tell? That neckpiece he wears. Some kind of family crest or something. I've seen it dozens of times at council meetings. Han chewed at his lip, trying to think. If that really was Bralia over there, finding out what he was up to could save them a lot of time. But Luke was probably sitting in the tap cafe downstairs right now waiting for them. I'm gonna follow him, he told Lando, shoving his datapad and the city map into the other's hands. You head down to the Mishra, grab Luke, and catch up with me. But if you're not with me in an hour, I'll try calling on the comlink, Han cut him off, stepping towards the outside of the ramp. They were nearly to the Bothan's level now. Don't call me. I might be someplace I wouldn't want a call beep going off. He stepped off the ramp into the walkway. Good luck, Lando called softly after him. There was a good scattering of aliens among the humans wandering around Illic, but Bralia's cream-colored fur stood out of the crowd enough to make it easy to follow him, which was just as well. If Han could recognize the Bothan, The Bothan could probably recognize him right back, and it would be risky to have to get too close. Luckily, the alien didn't seem to even consider the possibility that anyone might be following him. He kept up a steady pace, never turning around as he headed past cross streets and shops and atria towards the outer city wall. Han stayed with him, wishing he hadn't been so quick to give the city map to Lando. It might have been nice to have some idea where he was going. They passed through one final atrium and reached a section of warehouse type structures abutting a vast mural that seemed to have been painted directly on the inner city wall. Braille went straight to one of the buildings near the mural and disappeared through the front door. Han ducked into a convenient doorway about 30 meters down the street from the warehouse. The door Braille had gone through, he could see, carried the faded sign Amethyst Shipping and Storage above it. "I just hope it's on the map," he muttered under his breath, pulling his comlink from his belt. "It is," a woman's voice came softly from behind him. Han froze. "Hello?" he asked tentatively. "Hello," she said. "Turn around, please. Slowly, of course." Han did as ordered, the comlink still in his hand. "If this is a robbery—" "Don't be silly." The woman was short and slender, perhaps 10 years older than him, with close-cut graying hair and a thin face which under other circumstances would look friendly enough. The blaster pointed his direction was some kind of unfamiliar knockoff of a Blastech DL-18. Not nearly as powerful as his own DL-44, but under the circumstances the difference didn't matter a whole lot. "Put the comlink on the ground," she continued. "Your blaster, too, as long as you're down there." Silently, Han crouched down, drawing his weapon out with exaggerated caution. Under cover of the motion, with most of her attention hopefully on the blaster, he flicked on the comlink. Laying both on the ground, he straightened and took a step back, just to prove that he knew the proper procedure for prisoners. "Now what?" "You seem interested in the little get-together yonder," she said, stooping to retrieve the blaster and comlink. "Perhaps you'd like a guided tour." "That would be great," Han told her, raising his hands and hoping that she wouldn't think to look at the comlink before putting it away in one of the pockets of her jumpsuit. She didn't look at it. She did, however, shut it off. "I think I'm insulted," she said mildly. "That has to be the oldest trick in the list." Han shrugged, determined to maintain at least a little dignity here. "I didn't have time to come up with any new ones." "Apology accepted. Come on, let's go. And lower your hands. We don't want any passerby wondering now, do we?" "Of course not," Han said, dropping his hands to his sides. They were halfway to the amethyst when, off in the distance, a siren began wailing. It was, Luke thought as he looked around the Mishra, almost like an inverted replaying of his first visit to the Mos Eisley Cantina on Tatooine all those years ago. True, the Mishra was light years more sophisticated than that dilapidated place had been, with a correspondingly more upscale clientele. But the bar and tables were crowded with the same wide assortment of humans and aliens. The smells and sounds were equally variegated, and the band off in the corner was playing similar music, a style obviously that had been carefully tailored to appeal to a multitude of different races. There was one other difference, too. Crowded through though the place might be, the patrons were leaving Luke a respectful amount of room at the bar. He took a sip of his drink, a local variant of the hot chocolate Lando had introduced him to, this one with a touch of mint, and glanced over at the entrance. Han and Lando should have been only a couple of hours behind him, which meant they could be walking in at any minute. He hoped so, anyway. He'd understood Han's reasons for wanting the two ships to come into Illic separately, but with all the threats that seemed to be hanging over the New Republic, they couldn't really afford to waste time. He took another sip, and from behind him came an inhuman bellow. He spun around, hand automatically yanking his lightsaber from his belt, as the sound of a chair crashing over backwards added an exclamation point to the bellow. 5 meters away from him, in the middle of a circle of frozen patrons, a Barabel and a Rhodian stood facing each other over a table, both with blasters drawn. "No blasters! No blasters!" an SE-4 servant droid called, waving his arms for emphasis as he scuttled towards the confrontation. In the flick of an eye, the Barabel shifted aim and blew the droid apart, bringing his blaster back to bear on the Rhodian before the other could react. Hey, the bartender said indignantly. That's going to cost you. Shut up, the Barabel cut him off with a snarl. Rhodian will pay you, after he pay me. The Rhodian drew himself up to his full height, which still left him a good half meter shorter than his opponent, and spat something in a language Luke didn't understand. You lie, the Barabel spat back. You cheat. I know. The Rhodian said something else. You no like? The Barabel countered, his voice haughty. You do anyway. I call on Jedi for judgment. Every eye in the Tap Cafe had been riveted to the confrontation. Now, in almost perfect unison, the gazes turned to Luke. What? He asked cautiously. He wants you to settle the dispute, the bartender said, relief evident in his voice. A relief that Luke himself was far from feeling. Me? The bartender gave him a strange look. You're the Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker, aren't you? He asked, gesturing at the lightsaber in Luke's hand. Yes, Luke admitted. Well then, the bartender concluded, waving a hand towards the disputants. Except that, Jedi or no Jedi, Luke didn't have a drop of legal authority here. He opened his mouth to tell the bartender that, and then took another look into the other's eyes. Slowly, he turned back around, the excuses sticking unsaid in his throat. It wasn't just the bartender he saw. Everyone in the Tap Cafe, it seemed, was looking at him with pretty much the same expression, an expression of expectation and trust. Trust in the judgment of a Jedi. Taking a quiet breath, sternly ordering his pounding heart to calm down, he started through the crowd towards the confrontation. Ben Kenobi had introduced him to the Force. Yoda had taught him how to use the Force for self-control and self-defense. Neither had ever taught him anything about mediating arguments. All right, he said as he reached the table. The first thing you're going to do, both of you, is put away your weapons. Who first? The Barabel demanded. Rhodians collect bounty. He shoot if I disarm. This was certainly getting off to a great start. Suppressing a sigh, Luke ignited his lightsaber, holding it out so that the brilliant green blade was directly between the opposing blasters. No one is going to shoot anyone, he said flatly. Put them away. Silently, the Barabel complied. The Rhodian hesitated a second longer, then followed suit. Now tell me the problem, Luke said, shutting down the lightsaber but keeping it ready in his hand. He hire me for tracking job, the Barabel said, jabbing a keratin-plated finger at the Rhodian. I do what he say, but he no pay me. The Rhodian said something indignant sounding. Just a minute, we'll get to you, Luke told him, wondering how he was going to handle that part of the cross-examination. What sort of job was it? He asked me hunt special animal nest for him, the Barabel said. Animals bothering little ships, eating at sides. I do what he say. He burn animal nest, get money. But then he pay me and no good money. He gestured down on the now scattered pile of gold-colored metal chips. Luke picked one up. It was small and triangular, with an intricate pattern of lines in the center, and inscribed with a small 100 in each corner. Anyone ever see this currency before? He called, holding it up. It's new Imperial scrip, someone dressed in an expensive business coat said, with thinly veiled contempt. You can only spend it on Imperial-held worlds and stations. Luke grimaced. Another reminder, if he needed one, that the war for control of the galaxy was far from over. Did you tell him beforehand that you'd be paying in this? He asked the Rhodian. The other said something in his own language. Luke glanced around the circle, wondering if asking for a translator would diminish his perceived status here. He says that was how he was paid, a familiar voice said, and Luke turned to see Lando ease his way to the front of the crowd. Says he argued about it, but that he didn't have any choice in the matter. That is how the Empire's been doing business lately, someone in the crowd offered. At least around here. The Barabel spun towards the other. I no want your judgment, he snarled. Only Jedi give judgment. All right, calm down, Luke told him, fingering the chit and wondering what he was going to do. If this really was the way the Rhodian had been paid. Is there any way to convert these into something else? He asked the Rhodian. The other answered. He says no, Lando translated. You can use them for goods and services on Imperial worlds, but since no one in the New Republic will take them, there's no official rate of exchange. Right, Luke said dryly. He might not have Lando's experience in under the plate operations, but he hadn't been born yesterday either. So what's the unofficial exchange rate? No idea, actually, Lando said, looking around the crowd. Must be someone here who works both sides of the street, though. He raised his voice. Anyone here do business with the Empire? If they did, they were keeping quiet about it. Shy, aren't they? Luke murmured. About admitting Imperial dealings to a Jedi? Lando countered. I'd be shy too. Luke nodded, feeling a sinking sense in the pit of his stomach as he studied the Rhodian's tapir-like snout and passive, multifaceted eyes. He'd hoped that he could simply smooth out the problem and thereby avoid the need to pass any kind of real judgment. Now he had no choice but to rule on whether the Rhodian was in fact deliberately trying to cheat his partner. Closing his eyes down to slits, he composed his mind and stretched out his senses. It was a long shot, he knew, but most species showed subtle physiological changes when under stress. If the Rhodian was lying about the payment, and if he thought that Luke's Jedi skills could catch him at it, he might react enough to incriminate himself. But even as Luke ran through the sensory enhancement techniques, something else caught his attention. It was an odor, a faint whiff of Carababa tobacco and Armudu, the same combination Lando had called his attention to on the Sluice Van space station. Luke opened his eyes and looked around the crowd. Niles Ferrier, he called. Will you step forward, please? There was a long pause, punctuated only by Lando's sudden hissing intake of air at Ferrier's name. Then, with a rustle of movement from one side of the circle, a familiar, bulky figure pushed his way to the front. What do you want? He demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered blaster. I need to know the unofficial exchange rate between Imperial and New Republic currencies, Luke said. I thought perhaps you could tell me what it is. Ferrier studied him with an ill-concealed scorn. This is your problem, Jedi. Leave me out of it. There was a low rumble of displeasure from the crowd. Luke didn't reply, but held Ferrier in a level gaze, and after a moment the other's lip twisted. The last time I did business on the other side, we settled on a 5-4 Empire-Republic conversion, he growled. Thank you, Luke said. That seems straightforward enough, then, he continued, turning to the Rhodian. Pay your associate with New Republic currency at a 5-4 exchange rate and take the Empire's script back for the next time you work in their territory. The Rhodian spat something. That is lie, the Barabel snarled back. He says he doesn't have enough in New Republic currency, Lando translated. Knowing Rhodians, I'd tend to agree with the Barabel. Perhaps. Luke stared hard into the Rhodian's faceted eyes. Perhaps not, but there might be another way. He looked back at Ferrier, raised his eyebrows questioningly. The other was sharp, all right. Don't even think it, Jedi, he warned. Why not? Luke asked. You work both sides of the border. You're more likely to be able to spend Imperial script than the Barabel could. Suppose I don't want to, Ferrier countered. Suppose I don't plan to go back any time soon. Or maybe I don't want to get caught with that much Imperial script on me. Fix it yourself, Jedi. I don't owe you any favors. The Barabel whirled on him. You talk respect, he snarled. He is Jedi. You talk respect. A low rumble of agreement rippled through the crowd. Better listen to him, Lando advised. I don't think you'd want to get in the fight here, especially not with a Barabel. They've always had a soft spot for Jedi. Yeah, right behind their snouts, Ferrier retorted. But his eyes were flicking around the crowd now, and Luke caught the subtle shift in his sense as he began to realize just how much in the minority his opinion of Luke was. Or perhaps he was realizing that winding up in the middle of an official flap might buy him more attention than he really wanted to have. Luke waited, watching the other's sense flicker with uncertainty, waiting for him to change his mind. When it happened quickly. All right, but it'll have to be a 5-3 exchange, Ferrier insisted. The 5-4 was a fluke. No telling if I'll ever get it again. It is cheat, the Barabel declared. I deserve more from Rodian. Yes, you do, Luke agreed. But under the circumstances, this is probably the best you're going to get. He looked at the Rhodian. If it helps any, he added to the Barabel. Remember that you can pass a warning to the rest of your people about dealing with this particular Rhodian. Not being able to hire expert Barabel hunters will hurt him far more in the long run than he might cost you now. The Barabel made a grating noise that was probably the equivalent of a laugh. Jedi speak truth, he said. Punishment is good. Luke braced himself. This part the Barabel wasn't going to be nearly so happy about. You will, however, have to pay for the repair of the droid you shot. Whatever the Rhodian said or did, he is not responsible for that. The Barabel stared at Luke, his needle teeth making small, tight biting motions. Luke returned the cold gaze, senses alert to the Force for any intimation of an attack. Jedi again speak truth, the alien said at last, reluctantly but firmly. I accept judgment. Luke let out a quiet sigh of relief. Then the matter is closed, he said. He looked at Ferrier, then raised his lightsaber to his forehead in salute to the two aliens and turned away. Nicely done, Lando murmured in his ear as the crowd began to break up. Thanks, Luke murmured, his mouth dry. It had worked all right, but it had been more luck than skill, and he knew it. If Ferrier hadn't been there, or if the ship thief hadn't decided to back down, Luke had no idea how he would have solved the dispute. Leia and her diplomatic training would have done better than he had. Even Han and his long experience at hard bargaining would have done as well. It was an aspect of Jedi responsibility that he'd never considered before, but it was one he'd better start thinking about, and fast. Han's following up on one of Phalia's Bothan pals up on level 4, Lando said, as he moved in through the crowd towards the exit. Spotted them from the west central ramp and sent me to... He stopped short. From outside the Mishra, the sound of wailing sirens had started. I wonder what that is, he said, a touch of uneasiness in his voice. It's an alarm, one of the Tap Cafe patrons said, his forehead wrinkled in concentration as he listened. The pitch of the siren changed again. It's a raid. A raid? Luke frowned. He hadn't heard of any pirate activity in this sector. Who's raiding you? Who else? The man retorted. The Empire. Luke looked at Lando. Uh-oh, he said quietly. Yeah, Lando agreed. Come on. They left the Mishra and headed out into the wide avenue. Oddly enough, there were no signs of the panic Luke would have expected to find. On the contrary, the citizens of Illic seemed to be continuing about their daily business as if nothing untoward was happening. Maybe they don't realize what's going on, he suggested doubtfully as they headed for one of the spiral ramps. Or else they've got a quiet agreement with the Empire, Lando countered sourly. Maybe the leadership finds it politically handy to align themselves with the New Republic, but they also want to keep in the Empire's good graces. Since they can't pay anything as overt as tribute, they instead let the Imperials come in every so often and raid their stocks of refined biomolecules. I've seen that sort of thing done before. Luke looked around at the unconcerned crowds. Only this time it might backfire on them. Like if the Imperials spot the Lady Luck in your X-Wing on the landing records. Right. Where did you say Han was? Last I saw, he was on level 4 heading west, Lando said, digging out his comlink. He told me not to call him, but I think this qualifies as an unforeseen circumstance. Wait a minute. Luke stopped him. If he's anywhere near this Eight of Failures, and Ophelia is working some kind of deal with the Empire. You're right. Lando swore under his breath as he put the comlink away. So what do we do? They'd reached the ramp now and stepped onto the section spiraling upwards. I'll go find Han, Luke said. You get up to the landing area and see what's happening. If the Imperials haven't actually landed yet, you might be able to get into the air control computer and erase us from the list. R2 can help if you get him out of my X-Wing and over to a terminal without being caught. I'll give it a try. Okay. A stray memory flicked through Luke's mind. I don't suppose the Lady Luck's equipped with one of those full-rig slave circuits you talked about back on Naklon, is it? Lando shook his head. It's rigged, but only with a simple homing setup. Nothing much more than straight-line motion and a little maneuvering. I'd never be able to get it to me through the middle of an enclosed city like this. And even if it could, Luke had to admit, it wouldn't do them much good. Short of blasting a huge hole through the outer wall, the only way out of Illic for anything the size of a spaceship was through the exit ducts above the landing area. It was just a thought, he said. Here's where Khan got off, Lando said, pointing. He headed that way. Right. Luke stepped off the ramp. See you soon. Be careful. You too. And that's the end of the chapter.